Okay, we started to record. Thanks, Rav.
Gentlemen, the recording has begun. If anybody's got anything controversial to say, the recording has begun. Just so that you know that you're on record. Yeah. Okay. Mr. DJ, Michael's making a l'chaim for you.
Visual sponsors, my name.
We learn for Refuah Sholem for Bacher Miriam Bat Nechama Feiga. Please have in mind Bacher Miriam Bat Nechama Feiga for a Refuah Sholem. Another fellow that had a big operation today. Not sure of his mother's Hebrew name. So he's got Eileen, Aaron Ben Eileen. Should also have a Refuah Sholem.
Yeah, but Tanya
Bat Hoda'a Margalit. Okay, also Tanya Bat Hoda'a Margalit. Okay. Can everybody see where we're up to over here? Okay, yeah. I'm going to start off. Has everybody got a place in their Gemora? In Art Scroll, it's 39A1. No, it's A3. A4. Sorry. I don't think I can tell from here whether it's a 1, 2, 3, or 4. That little digit. 39A4 if it's an Art Scroll that you're using. Everybody got the place? If you are using a regular classic text like a prime, it's probably somewhere towards the bottom of Lamates. I'm using Svaria. Yeah. Lamates Amad Aleph, but right at the bottom. And last week, there's some very interesting stuff here. So let's get moving. Last week, we spoke about the fact that there were certain people that could be trusted. In other words, they had a sense of stature. That's going to come up again in this week's piece as well. The term that the Gemora used for somebody who could be trusted in last week's piece was a chaver, which is like a friend, like a chaver, a colleague, a contemporary, however you want to translate it. And this was a euphemistic term for somebody who is serious about certain laws, certain Jewish laws, particular ones, like the laws of kashrut, the laws of what ma'acholos asuros, what is prohibited to eat, tumah v'tara, ritual impurity. If you knew that the person is serious about these laws, then you could trust them. You would be able to trust them and eat their food. And this is actually an introduction, because the next piece of Gemora that we're going to learn is going to discuss, it's going to continue discussing matters of trust. Because if we said, as we did in the last 20 pages or so, that there were decrees about buying cheese from Gentiles and milk from Gentiles and fish if you can't tell exactly which fish it is, and wine that was made by them for all different baked foods, for all different reasons, how do you know who you can buy from and who you can't buy from? And if a Jew deposited food by a non-Jew, like for instance, he said, can I use some space? Maybe the non-Jewish guy also has a store and the Jewish guy doesn't have enough space, so he wants to put some stuff there. Or maybe somebody sells storage, or maybe somebody keeps stuff. He's a distributor. How do you know on what basis you can trust the person to take things that are in their possession? Maybe, for instance, the coming Gemara is going to say the Jew placed stuff by the non-Jew and he swapped it over. It's not the same meat. It's not the same fish. It's not the same cheese. How do you know? And some very important, pertinent halachas that we do that we observe in today's day and age come from these lines of Gemara that we're going to do tonight.
Specific to fish and not meat as well?
Fish, meat, yes, meat as well. Meat's on the list. You're going to see meat's on the list. Bread is on the list, although it's a lower level of seal. Yeah, bread. No, bread. Bread. So anyway, so just finishing off last week's, this we read already, but we'll just read it again for a quick chazara. Tanu Rabbanan Eishes Ha'ma'aretz Shenisus L'chaver, V'chein Bitu Shel Ha'ma'aretz Shenisus L'chaver, The rabbis taught that the wife of a commoner, in other words, a Jew who didn't have the status of being called a chaver, they couldn't be trusted in that same kind of way. So the Eishes Ha'ma'aretz she was a woman who was married to a commoner and she married a chaver, does that marriage lift her status? Because she used to be married, and we're saying commoner now, not in a class sense. We're saying commoner in a sense of, is this a person who can or cannot be trusted vis-a-vis kashrut and these kind of things? What about the daughter of an Am Haaretz that married a chaver? What about the servant of an Am Haaretz that became the servant of a chaver? So the Gemora says here, Kulan tzrichin lekabel divrei chaverus. They would have to make a proclamation. They would have to say, I know that in my previous tenure working for somebody who wasn't trusted, so therefore by extension I wasn't, because the Gemora had said last week that the trust of the main man of the household extends to the wife, it extends to the servants, it extends to the rest of the household. So if these people move to a different household, they would make what's called a proclamation of chaverus. Aval Aishes chaver shenisus la'am haaretz v'chein bitul shechaver shenisus la'am haaretz v'chein avdei shechaver shenim k'la'am haaretz einon tzrichin lekabel divrei chaverus lechatchila divrei Rabbi Meir. The Gemara says that Rabbi Meir took a more lenient view, where he said that the wife of a chaver, the daughter of a chaver, people who originally came from a strict household, who then moved to a household that was less than strict, would not have to accept upon themselves a proclamation of their piety, lechatchila, because of the fact that we could continue to trust them as we did in the past. Then Rabbi Yehuda opposed Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda said, Afhain tzrichin lekabel divrei chaverus lechatchila. They too have to make a proclamation of chaverut, which basically means in simple terms that they would declare and say that we still take kashrut seriously. We still take kashrut seriously. We still take tumah v'tara seriously. We are serious about halacha. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and this is exactly where we left off. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar would say, anecdotally, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar would say that is actually a story. Masa be'isha achas, there's a story of a particular woman, shenisus lachaver, that was originally married to a pious man, a man called a chaver. She was married to a man who was considered pious. She used to help him do mitzvot. She used to help him tie his tefillin on his hand. So in other words, it looked, the indications were that she was pious because he was pious. But afterwards, I don't know if he passed away or she got divorced from him, and instead she married a moiches, a crook, to put it bluntly, a tax collector. But the tax collectors in those days, the commentaries explain, were not savory people. They weren't honest people collecting for a fair government. They were generally shady people. So Nisus Lemoiches, she then married a tax collector. She assisted him with the evil stuff that he was doing. So in other words, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying that basically what you see is the woman goes along with whoever she's married to. When she was married to a pious person, she upheld his standard. She was married to somebody who's the opposite, she upheld his standard. So therefore, when they move from one marriage to another or from one household to another, it does not necessarily mean that the stamp of approval moves with them. That is the main point that the Gemora is making. That just because we had said that the household of a pious person goes along with that same person, it doesn't mean that those members of that household are going to be, plugged into the same set of values if you move them onto something else.
Luckily, women don't learn the shiur. You will have now a Mishabera.
But today it's the equivalent of having an hechsher from the basket in a sense.
The equivalent of a hechsher.
Well, today if you have a the hechsher replace the fact that we need to make declarations. So to some extent.
Well, they make it part of their getting a hechsher is they declare. Yeah. So I think also we have to remember that in that day and age, a lot of things were sold in a less commercial way. And that's very much what's coming up now in the next Gemora. It's a good intro to deal with this, is that basically people didn't open as much. There were marketplaces. There was a shuk, as you'd call it, where people sold their stuff in the marketplace. But many people sold stuff from home. So in other words, if somebody had a speciality, for instance, that they knew how to, how do you call it, how to make something, they would sell from home, they would sell clothes from home, they would sell food from home, they would sell wine from home. So basically people would know that if you want wine, that's the winemaker down the road over there. And if you want baked food, that's the guy that bakes. And people would go around and get different things. If they wanted to chelet, the dye for the tzitzit, they knew that certain people were involved in how to squeeze dye.
Omanim.
Yeah. Well, they were omanim, specialists, but they worked from home. I mean, I still say to, I still sometimes say to my children, today people go to the supermarket and certainly the big, huge stores in some places like the macros and whatever. When we were children growing up, there was one main street in Yeovil, Bradley Street, it's still there. And there was a dairy where you bought the milchiks, and there was a, another deli where you bought, there was Tiffany's. Yeah, do you remember Tiffany's? I remember Tiffany's. Yeah. There was Tiffany's and Fitz.
The other one,
Fitz. Do you remember Fitz, the old man, Mr. Sommer? Yeah. So they were there when I was growing up, but the idea was that each one was different. Yeah, Yeka means Jews of German descent. Yeah. No, his son is in the neighborhood here somewhere. The man that ran that bakery, his son is. I know the son. So and he did everything on his own. That old fellow, everything. He stood in the middle with his big trays, and everything was. I don't think there was any staff inside there. It was a tiny little store. Oh, really? You'll say to bake to Tiffany? Really? Yeah. Oh, with Eli Tuden, I think his name was the. He came in. Okay. Anyway, so the question was, one of the things the Gemora is going to discuss is who do you trust and who don't you trust? Because in those days, it wasn't like there was hechsherim, that people went around and they gave a stamp of approval here or there. You had to know who was who. And even amongst the non-Jews, who could you trust and who could you not trust? Because we learned that not everything you couldn't buy from them. There were certain things you could buy from non-Jews, but it still meant you had to know which one you could trust more than others. So the other thing was that if a Jew would deposit stock or stuff by a non-Jew, or anybody that wasn't considered to be trusted in matters of kashrut, it had to be sealed. And when it was sealed, how many seals? Did it have to have one seal or two seals? And that's how this Gemara opens up. Omar Rav taught. And everything, by the way, was always by acronym, because it's the easiest way to remember things, if things are put in an acronym. So Omar Rav said, Chavis, 4 items, who he's going to say what they are, who begin. Chavis is actually a bit like a picture, but the acronym Chavis, Chet, Bet, Yud, Taf, Ches, Beis, Yud, Taf. Those 4 things, Asur b'choisem echad, are prohibited if they only have one seal. In other words, if you find them in the hands of a non-Jew who's not meticulous with the laws of kashrut, or in the hands of a Jew who's known to be careless with halacha, then if it's got 2 seals from its original owner, so in other words, if the guy that's not to be trusted said, don't worry, there's a double seal here, since Rev Yankel or whatever put it here, he's got his double seal there, then it's okay. Sometimes only 1 seal is okay. Sometimes you need 2 seals, sometimes no seal. So the Gemara is discussing over here which items require double seals. Offhand, just so we know practically meat. Meat requires a double seal. If the butcher, he sends out meat on delivery, you'll notice that when it comes, they've got a nut, and usually inside the bag, it's also in another packet, and then the different things that qualify as a seal. A seal doesn't mean that it has to be like a document in wax. What it means is that there must be at least 2 identifying factors, that if the guy had to come along, he could say, that's my meat, I can see it. I know we pack it exactly like that. We fold under and then we move it that way, and we always pack our stuff facing this way. Everybody knows exactly how they pack. So the packaging could be one of the seals, and a packet over it could be another seal. But different things need different amounts of seals. So he says over here, these 4 items, chavis, ches, beis, yutaf, are not allowed with 1 seal. In other words, if you want to use it, you have to find it with 2. Champag, ches, mem, pei, gimel, mutzer, b'choisem echad. 1 seal is enough. And then he starts to say what they are. Chavis is cholov, basar, yayin, techeles. Milk, and the Gemora is going to question about milk afterwards. Milk and meat, cholov, basar, yayin, wine, and techeles, the dye that was used to make tzitzis or talis, the sky blue dye. Those 4 things, if the person that you are getting it from themselves is not trustworthy, or let's say a non-Jewish person that knows nothing about Jewish law, or a Jew that's not trustworthy, then you can only take it and trust it if it has got one seal. Sorry, champag mutter b'choisem echad. Oh, sorry. So the first thing, milk, meat, wine, and blue need 2 seals. 1 seal's not enough. Unbroken. 2 unbroken seals, 1's not enough. That means asur b'chotam echad. That means that if b'chotam echad. That means that if a non-Jew tells you, Ephraim, don't worry, comes from Moshe's meat, you need 2 seals there to prove that it comes from Moshe's meat. Chiltis moiras pas gevina. We spoke about chiltis before, that sharp stuff called chiltis. The fish stew called moiras, pas bread, and gevina and cheese. Mutarin b'choisem echad were allowed with only 1 seal. They didn't have to have. Sorry, chiltit, moiras, pas, and gevina. Chiltis moiras was fish stew. Chiltis was a sharp spice. Pas is bread, and gvina and cheese are allowed with only 1 seal.
It's weird that cheese is 1 seal and milk is 2 seals.
So the Gemora says afterwards that it actually isn't so. It moves them around, you'll see. That exact question comes up in a moment. So first thing the Gemora says, what's the story with bread? Why, for instance, did Rav say that bread needs to have 1 seal? So that it needs to have one seal. So he explains the following. What are we going to worry about when it comes to bread? You got a non-Jew, he's not trustworthy, and he's got bread. What's his gain by swapping the bread? What's he going to profit by opening it up and changing the bread that he got from the Jewish baker for his own bread? Maybe he'll change fresh bread for bread that's not fresh. So he'll say he'll get bread that's deposited by him, and he'll say, you know what, let me rather put my bread that isn't fresh in the packet and give it to this Jew and keep the fresh bread for myself. So the Gemora says, made the idea. The person will know, a Jew will know, if he's supposed to collect fresh bread, he knows what fresh bread is. It's today's bread. It's not going to help him to change it. He's going to tell him, you've changed it. I know the guy told me he brought the bread in the morning. Why are you giving me bread that's not fresh?
Yes.
The chitza sorry? The chitza b'desara, finding it interesting. The chitza b'desara, what would be if the non-Jew changed higher value bread that's made from wheat with lower value bread that's made from barley? In other words, he took bread made from a fine wheat flour and changed it for a barley bread. Now he made the idea. The Jew will know also. He'll say, I know exactly what you've done. I've had a high quality wheat bread dropped off here by you, and you're trying to give me a barley bread. So the only way he could change it, if the 2 breads are the same, maybe he might think this is just a little bit better, but they're basically the same. And how's this Jew going to know that it was really swapped over? Then, given the choisem echad, because there's 1 seal, he's not going to bother to change the seal and to forge it. You know, people that study, it's not a nice example, but it is a good example. People that study criminology will tell us that the crime is usually designed based on what pays. In other words, they're going to put in effort based on if it's worthwhile. If there's nothing to steal, less effort is going to be made on forgery, and people are not going to spend, I don't know what, as much trying to forge let's say, for instance, some weak currency compared to trying to print dollars or something, they're going to always forge something that's worth a lot. So if, sorry,
Not the rand.
not the rand, they're not going to want to copy the rand. So therefore, he says, so the Gemara is saying that if there's only one seal, then it's already enough that your average person, and don't forget, we're not talking about an exact science, we're talking about a chazaka, that means an average. Your average fellow is not going to make a big effort to redo the seal just to change one bread for another that's very similar. You know, he's not going to say, if there's one seal that's considered good enough, hence the sages said that if you want to know that your bread's kosher, one seal's good enough if the bread is deposited by a non-Jew or a Jew who's not trustworthy. So then the Gemara asks, what's the difference between cheese that we said that the cheese is like the bread? It was on the same list that it's okay if there's only one seal. He's not going to worry to change one cheese for another. So one seal. Milk should be exactly the same. In other words, the Gemara is trying to understand why would Rav make a distinction between cheese and milk. The rabbis made a gezerah in general about milk from Gentiles, and chalav, that's where the basis of the whole concept of chalav Yisrael, milk that was milked with a Jew present, a Jew supervising. In fact, we're coming to the end of this Mishnah. The next Mishnah is going to talk about it in more detail. When we get to the next Mishnah, it's going to talk about the whole story of how chalav Yisrael is developed, not tonight, down the line. But over here, the main question the Gemara is asking is, why did Rav put milk and cheese in two different categories? Where he said that milk needs two seals to be sure that it's Jewish milk, kosher milk, and cheese doesn't. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Kana said, Apik chalav, take milk out the list, the ayal had put in Chatikas dag she'ein basiman, a piece of fish that has no siman, that has no sign. In other words, Rav Kana says, you're right. Milk and cheese is in fact the same thing. Both milk and cheese, one seal is enough to know that it's trustworthy. The Jew deposited milk or cheese by a non-Jew. You know, non-Jew, let's say, is a depot. He's selling, and he says that he's got stock from a Jew. One seal is enough, whether it's milk, whether it's cheese. We don't differentiate. The chet, you know, you remember Rav made an acronym, is not for chalav. That chet is not for milk. Take milk out, delete, extract the milk, and instead put in chatikat dag she'ein ba siman, a piece of fish with no mark. We spoke about this also. If a person gets a fillet, I think they call it, with no skin on it, just a piece of flesh, fish that's just a piece, like a tuna roast. It looks like a blob of a tuna steak. That's a good example. A tuna steak that's got no mark on it. So that over there, if it doesn't have a siman, how do you know where it comes from? That is a problem, because you don't know where it comes from. If it's got a siman, like maybe a particular factory might cut a little incision mark in it and say, that's our sign over there. We always do that in the corner. But if there's no mark on this piece of tuna or this piece of fish, how do you know where it comes from? And Rav Kana says that was really the chet in Rav's list, that one seal is not good enough, that you need two. What he meant was a piece of flesh, in this case, the flesh of a fish, and that must have two seals. And if it's only one seal, it's asur, it's prohibited, it's not enough. Maybe the guy could have changed it or fiddled with it. One seal, not enough. So to summarize, in the case of milk, one seal is good enough, because milk is the same as cheese. The original, how would you call it, statement where we spoke about milk is, how do you call it, is to be changed, adjusted. It's not really milk, it's chalav, it's chatichat dag she'ein ba siman. But then the Gemara asks a question, Hainu Bacher, but isn't this the same as meat? In other words, Rav already had in his list that a piece of meat that's not marked is a problem. And meat and fish for this purpose is the same thing. It's so-called a piece of flesh, a steak, a piece of flesh or fillet that has no sign on it, no stamp, no seal. It's exactly the same thing. It should be the same rule. So why does Rav have to list Bacher, meat, which, by the way, Bacher means meat, but in a broader term, it could actually mean the flesh of anything living. So why would he need to list in his list meat as well as a piece of fish that has no mark? Obviously, if a piece of meat can't be proven where it comes from, the same thing with a piece of fish if it can't be proven where it comes from. In fact, if a person's not, how do you call it, doesn't know much about food, they could even mix up a piece of tuna with a piece of meat. A tuna steak would be mixed, could be, how do you call it, confused with meat. Hainu Bacher, it's meat. So the Gemora says, Trei Gavna Bacher, it's two types of meat. Fish, the flesh of a fish is one kind of meat, and the flesh of a beef or a living, a dry land animal is another kind of meat. And the idea is Rav wanted them separated. He wanted, even though the halacha is exactly the same, that you do need to have double seal if you want to know where it came from. The non-Jew has to be able to show you that it's double sealed, certified to have come from a Jew. But it's better if the two types were mentioned separately because they come from two different animals, and their other laws to do with them are different. Fish doesn't have to be shechted. It's a kosher fish, you yank it out the water and make your braai. But a meat, if you're not a sheichet, you can't run around and catch a chicken and have a braai.
You can see the skin. It's in
Exactly, the skin is the simon. But we're talking here about she'ein basim. Chatichat dag, she'ein basim. There's no simon, so if there's no simon, you have to know who was the fish of, who cut it, exactly. So then the Gemara says that was the way that Rav presented this teaching. Shmuel Omer, by Shmuel, there's a similar teaching. Shmuel was Rav's contemporary. There's a similar teaching by Shmuel. Shmuel Omer, Shmuel taught Beis Asur, Bayit, like Beis Yud Taf Asur B'choisem Echad. Three things. Bet Yud Taf are prohibited if there's only one seal. In other words, they need two seals. So it's a different version of the same kind of lesson, Shmuel. He's also teaching, using acronyms, that certain food items require more than one seal. Certain food items, one seal is enough. Maybe some don't require any seal at all. So Shmuel says, Beis Yud Taf, Bayit Asur B'choisem Echad, one seal's not enough. They're prohibited if there's only one seal. Machag Mem Ches Gimel Mutzah B'choisem Echad, one seal is enough. What are they? The bayit is basar yayin tcheles, meat, which is which we would think is beef, meat, wine, and tchelet and sky blue dye, asurin b'choisem echad, are prohibited if you find them with only one seal. Moirais, chiltis, gavina, fish stew, the sharp spice called chiltis, and cheese, mutarin b'choisem echad, one seal is enough. But if there's no seal, it's a problem. You see the different levels. So Moirais, chiltis, and kvina, mutarin b'choisem echad. The Gemora says, by Shmuel, we don't see any mention of the piece of fish that doesn't have a mark. So the Gemora says, Lishmuel chatichas dag she'ein ba siman hainu basar. According to Shmuel, a piece of fish that doesn't have a mark is the same as a piece of meat that doesn't have a mark. Yes, according to him, you can put the two in the same category. You don't have to list them separately. Hence, they're not listed separately. His view is you don't have to talk about two types of flesh. The bottom line is we're not talking now about whether it's fish, whether it's meat for dietetic purposes, and I don't know, vegetarians that might eat fish and not meat. We're talking here, can you trust the non-Jew or not, who has this piece of flesh, this tuna steak or beef steak or whatever it might be, filleted piece of meat in their possession. They say that it comes from a trustworthy source. The person is offering information that Reb Yankel, the butcher, who's a pious man, brought it here, and he put it on my shelf. How do we know if we can trust that that really happened? You need two seals. Then the Gemara continues and says, we can carry on a bit. This was a very interesting...
how can you compare meat and fish? I mean, with meat, you've got about 4 problems to worry about.
We're not comparing them.
No, but he said that meat and fish is the same category.
For this particular purpose, whether you can trust the guy when there's no seals.
But that's what
we're talking about. We're talking about 4
problems.
No, because it doesn't. They both derisa problems. If the fish is treif and the meat is treif, you've got the same problem, a problem in derisa. That's the bottom line, exactly. If you're going to eat a piece of meat that's not kosher, whether it's not kosher because it came from an animal that's in general not kosher, whether it comes from an animal that wasn't shechted, even if it was shechted but it wasn't kosher properly, and it became treif because nobody
Because
koshered
the
it.
fish, if you see a piece of the skin and you can identify that it got fin,
Yeah,
and you got the.
but you can't identify it. We're talking about where you can't. Yeah, you can't.
That's part
In
of
other
the
words,
seal. Part of the
sorry?
seal.
Yeah,
It's got the seal.
if you could, you wouldn't need a seal at all. You wouldn't need a seal.
No,
If
the
you've got
skin is a
skin-
seal.
No,
Right, but not,
Because of the seal.
right, but this is talking about things that don't have seals.
Right.
If you go and you buying from a guy and it can be defined, that's a different law. It's, you're saying what would be if it was cold in the afternoon? It's not. In the afternoon, it's warm, and in the morning, it's cold. We're talking here of a particular problem. The problem of finding a piece of flesh. I'm saying flesh because that could be the meat of a fish or the meat of a cow or the meat of a lamb. You're finding it in the hands of somebody. And even if you are a food technician, you can say, hold on a second, I can tell you that that's lamb. I can even tell you which part of the lamb it comes from. It still doesn't help you know that it was shechted.
But in fish,
and
The only thing you do know-
if it kosher.
The only thing you do know is if it's very delicious, then maybe it isn't kosher.
you know,
Sorry? From the hindquarter.
like fish, like salmon, you can see it's kosher.
There's a,
This game.
there's a famous story. I'm sure I've told the story many years ago, but it fits well with this particular Gemora. In the time of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, he had a chassid. He was a pious man, but he was a bit of a joker, a bit of a clown. He had a huge sense of humor. His name was Reb Shmuel Munkus. So he was quite pious, but he also was a bit of a, how do you call it? He was like the palace jester, they would call it. The man who made all the jokes. Yeah, the chevra man in the crowd. What happened was one time they were learning, they were davening, they were verbringing. The people were like really having a long session. And then, and you know how it is, if you're learning and whatever, thank God the people who bring food and you sit and you verbring and you have food. And suddenly, after a few hours of intense whatever, somebody came in with lung. Now, lung was considered quite a delicacy in those days. A cooked lung brought into the room. And he noticed that a lot of the people in the room, they were looking at the lung and they were salivating. They were getting excited. Have you ever seen it? Yeah, lung was a big delicacy. By the way, lung was the original filling in pierogan. In the old days, they used to put lung in the pierogan.
Yeah.
So he noticed, Reb Shmuel looked around the room and the people were all like getting very excited about the lung. And he didn't like it. He thought it was a bit too, how do you call it? It wasn't, he didn't like it. He didn't think it was idle that these people should get so excited about food. I guess, he didn't get excited about food, but whatever. He thought it was too much. So the next thing, he was dancing and he was a bit of a trickster. So he took the tray with a lung and he flipped it in the air and he was doing all these tricks and they were getting a little bit nervous. Like this is our delicious food we're about to eat. And you're throwing it in the air and you're catching it. And then suddenly he goes to the side of the room and there was a window. And the next thing, the tray with the lung goes out the window and into the ditch. And the people, they were very angry at him. So they grabbed him and they started to smack him a little bit. Like, what the heck? This was our snack. This was our snack. Now, you know how it worked in the old days in the little towns. They didn't have big butcheries and big abattoirs. They had a little sheikhet and a little rabbi, whatever. The next thing, a messenger comes to the room and he's banging on the door and he says, I'm desperate. Can I find somebody? He says, I hope you guys didn't eat that lung yet. So we just got a message that animal wasn't kosher, that there was a shayla on the animal, and somebody ran to the Rav, and he said it's a problem with treifus. That whole animal was no good. We were hoping to catch you before you ate it, but now we see it's gone. They said, no, nobody ate anything. This guy chucked it out the window. So then they said to him, hold on a second. You're what's it call it? A bit of a mystic. A makubal, in other words, and that was also considered to be not allowed. In other words, you're not supposed to play with magical stuff. So they said that means you're busy divining, you're doing funny things. If you could figure out that stuff was no good, and now you were playing with it so no one should eat it, and then you chucked it out. So they grabbed him and they said, you have to get a smack for the stuff that you do. You're playing around with funny things. So he said, it's not at all this. So he said, then how did you know it wasn't kosher? He said, I just looked at the way you were all looking at it. And I knew immediately if you were getting so excited then
Gotta be trusted.
Anyway, so in those days, in the time of the Gemora, in the time of the Talmud, so one of the things they said was that in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel itself, the chazaka was that most of the residents of the land of Israel were trusted with most of the food items. So in other words, you had no problem. You could go from house to house, and if anybody baked bread, or they were a meat chopper, or they made a good kugel or whatever, buy what you want. But over the border in Syria, apparently there were Jews there that weren't as meticulous. They were a bit more naughty. They were happy to sell people stuff that wasn't necessarily ay. So that's where the next Gemara comes from. The Tanu Rabbanan ein loichin yud memches gimel b'Surya. You're not allowed to buy, one should not purchase these foods on this list, and that's even from Jews who live in Syria. Lo yayin v'lo moirais v'lo cholav. You shouldn't buy their wine or their fish stew or their milk. V'lo melach salkondaris, nor their salt. That's called salkondaris. This funny word salkondaris, the commentaries on the Gemara try to explore what it means. Apparently it was some kind of salt spice that was often used by the nobility in Roman times. You know, like you get sometimes certain spice companies do it to this day. They take herbs and they turn the salt into like a salty herb spice. So, for instance, I think the that A. Vogel company does it. Have you ever seen Herbamare or that? Herbamare does it. So it's basically sometimes they process the salt together with other foods. Call it flavored salt. They sell flavored salt. So there was a flavored salt that seemed to come from the Roman nobility called salkondaris. V'lo chiltis, not chiltis, v'lo gvina, not cheese, elo mina mumcha. Unless it is a registered expert. Mumche in this case actually means like a chover further up, somebody that was known to be an expert also in the laws of kashrut. So what was interesting, you have a kulan, and all of them, Ibn Sarayach, Eitzel Balabais, if you're a guest and he's a Balabais, mutter, then it's permissible. In other words, the ban was only on buying from them. But if you went to them as a guest, you could trust them. It's a very interesting distinction, that the idea was that in a household, they're not going to give you anything wrong. But they were not considered trustworthy with regard to what they sold. But they were considered trustworthy if you ate in their house. In other words, they didn't feed themselves anything wrong. In their own houses, they were careful. This is how this particular group of people, that's how Chazal earmarked it, that they were careful in their own houses, but they were not careful commercially with what they sold. So therefore, don't buy any of their stuff. Obviously, that's the general rule. It could be that a person has a record of being trustworthy. The general rule is most of them weren't, but it could be that some rabbi will tell you that so-and-so, he's a proper chover, he's a proper mumcha, he knows what he's doing, he's not going to lead you astray. This is a proof, this is a support to the teaching of Rabbi Yashur ben Levi. The Amar Rabbi Yashur ben Levi taught, Shigur lo balabais lebeisoi mutter. If the balabais sent him something to his house, it's permissible. My timer, what's the reason? So what Rabbi Yashur ben Levi said was, even those people in Syria that the sages said, and we're not blaming the Syrians of today or whatever, it was obviously a day and age, and that Rabbi Yashur ben Levi said that if they sent you something like a food parcel, like a mishloach manot, that would be okay, because a food parcel sent as a gift is the same as the food that you eat in the person's house. Shigar lo balabais lebeisa, if the balabais sent it to his house, mutter, it's okay. My timer, balabais lo shavik hetayil v'achal isura. The balabais, if he has stuff at home that's kosher and not kosher, he himself is going to eat the kosher. He's not going to eat the isur and leave the kosher. If he's going to give himself kosher, then he's going to give you kosher too. In other words, he's going to serve you from what he eats. So if you're eating his own food, then you're in good shape, because it's good for him to eat the kosher food. He's going to eat it, and that's what he's going to send you. It reminds me, it's good for the goose is good for the gander. What did I read recently? Somebody said that just the other day, somebody told me, he said, don't ask the doctor, what should I do? Ask him, what would you do if you were in my position? How would you advise yourself? So he would only eat the highest standard. Sorry?
You can ask him what you especially if he's sitting next to you.
So I think that's where we'll
Where did you get up to this?
Masayel el Rabbi Shimon Levi. We'll reread that.
That.
Yeah.
Another
Or
one.
Melach Salka and Daris. Salka and Daris salt. We'll start from there. From Salka and Daris salt. Okay, Liz, you're concluding there. You can stop the recording.
Hey, Rav. Yeah. Okay, I will switch it off.
We're done with the
Okay,
recording.
okay, I'm gonna switch it off.
Everybody finish eating?
Yeah.
Thank you, Rav. All the best.